Just a quick disclaimer before we start. John and Dan are not affiliated with Bleakley Advisory Group and Private Advisor Group, and nothing they say should be taken as investment advice, and nothing I say will be taken as medical advice. We want to start by talking about today's payroll number, where we saw a decline of 20.5 million jobs, which was obviously a shocking number. Took the unemployment rate to almost 15%. And if you add back what's possibly an adjustment for the differential in people saying they're unemployed or those that are just temporarily not at work, that number is really about 20%. But we have to understand that this is a self-inflicted situation. It wasn't like a natural progression of the economy that deteriorated into recession. This was a forced upon us recession in order to fight the virus. So the hope in the markets and why it was up today is that as the economy reopens, a lot of these jobs do come back. And that ends up being the question is how many businesses will come back and will be able to reopen? What's the extent of their rehiring? And then what is going to be the traffic flows into these businesses? And that is something that we'll be monitoring over the next couple of months. So we want to start with the guests. I want to introduce my friend John Mousseau, who's President and CEO of Cumberland Advisors and Director of their fixed income department. It's a multi-billion-dollar asset manager, and John's expertise is municipal bonds. And I thought there's no better time to really be talking about the municipal bond world in the context of state and local budgets that have gotten very stretched here, pension funds that have underfunding, and more so with this decline in the markets. So I guess the first question to you, John, is in this kind of environment with such a drain on revenues, how are state and local governments adjusting on the expense side, and how much are a lot of them really relying on government help to sort of fill a lot of these holes?
Well, thanks, Pete. And you're right. State and local governments have a big task in front of them. You talked about multi-billion-dollar deficits, whether you're talking about the state of California, which has a $53 billion deficit on their hands, or some cities that might have $7 or $8 million deficits on their hands. And you make a good point in the sense that most state and local governments were in very good shape coming into this. And it's a shock, and it's a downward shock. So our feeling here is that you're going to see as much help as you probably need out of the federal government. You've already seen it in a couple of different forms. You've seen it in terms of last month in March, or really almost a month and a half ago, you saw the Treasury announce a plan where they would buy municipal bonds up through 5 years, investment grade or better, let flexibility in there if they wanted to change the maturity structure of it. Just the fact that they put that into place helped to cure up the municipal bond market. Here you are a month and a half later, they still haven't funded any of it. But the fact that it's there helped a lot. Very much think about it in the way that Boeing was able to achieve financing with just the fact that the federal government would be there as a backstop, but didn't have to be a backstop. So similarly, municipal bond yields have come back down somewhat since they were really thrown out of whack from all the bond fund selling in the middle of March. The other part that's helped is that the Fed has stepped up with a $500 billion note program. That is for states, counties, and cities, and that's to get them short-term financing if they need it, and they feel like they're being shut out of the capital markets, at least at a market rate. They can go to the Fed will buy notes directly. And that's important for the municipalities as we go back to work, because the most important thing is how do we pay our bills? Because we know whether you are a general obligation issuer and collecting taxes, whether they be property taxes or income taxes in the case of something like New York City, or you're a revenue bond issuer where you are collecting revenues like the Florida Turnpike Authority, for example. We know that debt service will start to restore itself. Will it be thinner than it was? Absolutely. Will there be downgrades? No question. Will you see some invasion of debt service reserve funds? Most likely. Could you see some interruption of debt service in certain places? Could be. Will you see wholesale defaults We think not. The history of the Great Depression, which is probably second most only to what we're going through in terms of downshift, and you just made that point to the number of people that are out of work as of today, because that is second only to the Great Depression. We think what you see is the fact that municipalities have monopolistic functions, and they control the entities in which they serve and the taxing power upon their locales. So if you looked at the Great Depression, you had about 1,700 municipal entities actually stop paying on their debt, and almost all of them, except for a few Dust Bowl towns, resumed paying their debt and paid it off in arrears. So we think that's the worst case that happens, and we think it's actually better than that, because on top of what the Fed is doing on the notes, we also know that the Congress is preparing another basically almost $1 trillion program to go to states, and that is to shore up unemployment programs, which are getting close to being depleted. I think some of the posturing you saw by Senator McConnell a couple of weeks ago wasn't so much, hey, we think states should go bankrupt, as much as because they really can't, but more, hey, any help that we give the states, we don't want it leaking into unfunded pension plans. And listen, pension plans take a hit here.
Hey, John, I got a question on that. So you just muttered because they can't. Can you elaborate?
Sure. Senator McConnell made the what we thought was a poor choice of words when he said it would be good if states had the ability to default, and basically to go bankrupt, was just the term, and not have to use federal money. In other words, reorganize their debts under a bankruptcy code. Well, they don't have that. They're sovereign, states are sovereign governments. So Chapter 9, like Detroit pursued in court, is not available to states. But more importantly, even if it was, a state would have to prove insolvency. And to prove insolvency, you have to say you've done all these things to try to meet your debts. That would include selling state assets like office buildings and like turnpike authorities and reducing workers, et cetera, et cetera. And they would be nowhere close to doing that. So I think the important thing is to recognize the difference between an insolvency issue, which the states and local governments don't have for the most part, and a liquidity issue for cash on hand, which they do have.
So if I'm a retirement age investor looking for blue chip investments, and typically look for dividends in these municipal bonds, what do you say to me as that retirement age investor?
When you look at very high grade municipal debt, whether you're talking about certain state GOs, think about the state of Florida here, a AAA state not on credit watch to be downgraded, or a very high quality utility bond. And remember, you think about things not transportation related, which clearly have taken a hit, but more of the water, sewer, electric revenue bonds, which have some billing risk, of course, but in general, those bills are for the most part being met. Listen, the market backed off and then kind of rebounded. But as you sit here today, you look at a long tax-free bond at around 3%. That's a taxable equivalent of almost 4.5%. How does that compare to a long treasury bond, which you do pay taxes on, at less than 1.5%? So tax-free bonds are very cheap on a relative basis. On a nominal basis, you're about back to where you were last December and November.
So John, you as an investor, are you approaching the markets any differently today than you were in January, February in terms of the geographies of bonds that you're looking at? Are you less inclined to say buy an Illinois bond because of the further stress on them, and more inclined to look at Florida and other higher quality states with respect to their fiscal situation?
Yes, but we were avoiding lots of those states anyway. So we were avoiding anything having to do with the states of Illinois, New Jersey, Kentucky, and Connecticut even prior to this mess. Doesn't mean you don't buy a bond somewhere else in the state. So you might be avoiding bonds of anything to do with the state of Illinois, Doesn't mean you don't buy Northwestern University. It doesn't mean you don't buy a AAA school district there that's based on property taxes. Similar analogies can be made in the other states as well. What we are doing is we are lengthening the durations and maturities of what we are buying. We were very defensive going into this. And so that relative differential that I just made is the result of this pandemic pricing, where treasury yields are very low and we think yields and everything else are kind of high. And what we think happens over time is they kind of meet with treasury yields slowly going higher and yields on other instruments slowly coming lower.
So is there an area of the yield curve that you find particularly attractive? You said longer durations. You talking maybe 5 to 10 years or north of 10?
No, I'm talking 30-year bonds.
Oh, so a full out 30 years, right?
You bet.
John and Peter, I have a question. I saw today that in the healthcare field, we've lost about 1.4 million jobs in healthcare month to month, which is the first decline in healthcare related jobs back-to-back months, I think, in a long time. It used to be a safe haven for people looking for work. With these unemployment numbers, how do you dig your way out of this unemployment number, and how long is it going to take?
Well, I think the hope is a lot of them were more furloughed than permanently lost, and that a lot of doctors' offices, to use that as an example, that literally had to shut their offices because they weren't allowed to do elective procedures, that as that comes back, a lot of those jobs lost will quickly come back. Now, John, I'm sure like you see hospital muni bonds and a lot of healthcare related stuff. How are you approaching that area of the market?
Healthcare bonds, like other bonds, and we would have considered healthcare bonds an essential service revenue bond going into this, as opposed to something that was a convention center or a golf course bond or something more specious. The downdraft here, and your brother just made a good point, is the fact that so many of these hospitals have had a 2-month recess, if you will, from doing elective surgeries, which pay a lot of the revenue that goes into funding the bonds, debt service on the bonds. That will start to resume. Are hospitals losing money right now? Absolutely. Will once you get back to whatever the new normal is, you're going to see people in there for the gallbladder operation as well as the facelift. And I think when you see that, you'll start to see a resumption of debt service. Doesn't mean that things aren't thinner for a while. I think one of the things you come out of this is that there's going to be less debt service coverage on bonds, maybe much less, maybe invasion of debt service, like I said. And I think new issues that come to market, at least for a certain rating, you're going to see a demand for higher levels of debt service coverage as you go forward. So I think what that does is going to make a bias towards someone who might have qualified for a AA rating pre-pandemic might only get an A rating post-pandemic.
Got it. Thank you. Well, John, I want to really thank you for taking out the time to join us. That information was very timely and very, very helpful. So thank you so much.
Really John, I've got, if you can, hey, John, can you hear me? Just do a sound check. One last question just came in from the audience. Clearly, we are in a prolonged period of QE as first the Fed and Treasury need to flood the market with liquidity, and that will prop up hard asset values. But we are in a lifetime of QE as the Fed needs to keep buying the long end of the curve to keep rates down. Who will be buying our debt when we get through this? Did you catch that?
Right now, the Federal Reserve is buying the Treasury's debt, and the model that you have here is World War II. A little different time frame, but the model in World War II is the Fed kept the Treasury bond yield then, the 10-year bond, at 2%. And then, like now, they had an unlimited bid to buy. And obviously, if they thought rates were too low, they could sell. But I think you're in the same mode now. The real question is that when you think about how much the Fed has actually been buying, which has been a lot, and it's been at least on the same level as the last quantitative easing of 2013, you would almost think that the 10-year bond yield would be lower than it is, and it's not. And there's been a heck of a lot of buying. So I think that the market is a little wary of inflation, not now, but down the road. And that is not created by the quantitative easing program, because that in and of itself doesn't create inflation. It is the large amount of fiscal stimulus, which we know has come and more will be coming. And that, of course, is where might start to see inflation show up. I mean, you're already seeing some weird things. I'll leave it at this because I know you're on time frame, but you're already seeing companies now that are starting to go back to work. And here you are with as you pointed out, not a 15% unemployment rate, probably closer to 20. And what do you think the company's biggest problems are as they go back to work? They can't get workers. The workers are sitting at home collecting unemployment because it's about the same as they would be getting for work, and they're not going to ready to give it up yet. So
yeah, we saw that last week.
Yeah, that is a conundrum, and the states are knocking on doors and taking names because they don't want. And that, when you think about it, when you think about the federal government's attitude on this, which is almost no asset be left behind, you can almost start to feel the pendulum swinging the other way, saying, geez Louise, have we overshot this and done too much for everybody and everything?
Interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you, John. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you, John. Really appreciate it.
Everybody have a nice weekend. Thanks.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you. Is that better? Another sound check, and then we'll introduce our two special guests. Can you guys hear okay? Peter, Johnny?
Yep, you sound good.
Okay, great. All right, so we have Tovah Klein. Thank you, Tovah, for joining us, and Niki Leondakis. Thank you both for joining us. I'll introduce both of you at the same time. So Tovah is a child psychologist and researcher and the director of the Barnard College Center for Toddler Development, also a developmental advisor to Sesame Street and HBO. You're a regular on GMA, an author of How Toddlers Thrive, and the terrific wife of our big brother and host last week, Kenny Bookvar. And then my good friend, Niki Leondakis, is here. We're so excited to have you, Niki. You're CEO of CorePower Yoga, which I think has over 200 plus locations in 23 states now. You're also on the board of the RealReal, which we want to talk about. You've been CEO of Equinox Gym, CEO of Commune Hotels, COO of Kimpton Hotels, a real superstar, and still on the board, I think, of Dress for Success also. But your claim to fame really is that you taught me how to do and hold a handstand. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. Well, it's mental health awareness month, and we wanted to have both of you on and look forward to asking you some questions. Tovah, I'll start with you. First of all, welcome. Talk to us about what do adults need to know about mental health now, and how are you talking to them, obviously, during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very stressful time. I don't need to be the one telling people that. And what people should know is that anxiety, worry, depression would be very, very normal right now. I think people are very worried about, am I going to be okay? And some degree of anxiety and fear is completely called for right now. People who have pre-existing conditions, so who have dealt with anxiety, depression, other kind of mental health issues in the past, this could be a particularly difficult time, and people who have past trauma. So, if people are really feeling down and feeling that they can't get through the day, then certainly reaching out to providers, either current therapists or their doctor, and getting support is really key right now. This is going to be a long haul, and people need to be aware that that stress will get to many people.
Johnny, I meant to ask you this. Tovah and I were talking. Does Medicare currently cover telemedicine for therapy?
Absolutely. In fact, it's becoming easier and easier. And I think one of the silver linings for this pandemic is how easy now it is to submit claims for reimbursement for mental health claims. Obviously, it's still provider dependent and healthcare health insurance dependent, but the ease with which to communicate with telemedicine with a psychologist or a psychiatrist now, I think is easier. Tovah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, than it's ever been. And also, I think that in general, the health insurance companies are lowering the threshold for submitting claims and not denying claims in this time period, and of course, some of them are waiving copays and deductibles and co-insurance. And so it has become one of the nice things to see in this multi-billion-dollar industry that is essentially thriving when a lot of other industries are struggling, that part of our industry is being humane and allowing us to get the mental health that we need.
Yeah. And also the providers very quickly got either online or through phone calls. So people who may not have done mental health or therapy this way quickly move to it. And even with children, people are experimenting and getting very creative because everybody knows that what people need right now is connection. So the thing that will counter some of the mental health issues is for people to find ways to be connected. You know, if a call with friends or with grandparents or something like that helps you, you know, if house party helps you, whatever it is, to find connection in a fairly disconnected time is really key for bolstering those mental health pieces.
Tovah, now that the weather is getting warmer and we're approaching summertime, do you think just the ability to start going outside again, whether it's taking a walk in your neighborhood or going to the park or just being outside will help relieve some of that mental stress of being locked up?
I hope so. You know, I work with families with parents and children, and throughout this whole thing, I've said, don't let weather stop you. I mean, being outside, feeling fresh air, you know, being with nature, if it's in your yard or in a park, is really important. And so even a little bit will go a long way, a walk around the block. The problem, of course, is going to be in the city, and they're already putting things in place for this weekend, is that lots of people are going to be outside. But certainly being fresh air, nature, exercise is really key, like really key. So all of that is important. I have a colleague at Barnard College who just got a grant to study access to green spaces and being in green spaces and mental health during this pandemic. So it's definitely an important piece of not just being locked down in whatever space you're in.
I saw you did a piece on CNN maybe 4 weeks ago or so, and you said in how to discuss the pandemic with children that, relatively speaking, children are spared this disease. And now some of the headlines that we're seeing is this idea that there are children getting something similar to Kawasaki's disease, this inflammatory disorder. And frankly, I don't like these articles where they're very low numbers, but now you have a panicked parent population where the news has run a little bit thinner. So this is now getting headline that children are not so safe anymore. In fact, because there's less other news, Kawasaki's like illness is getting the headlines, and it's really
not news.
So there were like 60 kids that.
So how do you handle that when parents come running to you?
Yeah. It was a big discussion this morning with a group of parents. You know, like everything else, I think it's almost a metaphor for this pandemic, which is how do you take in constant new news and not good news and balance that with remembering the larger picture. So if we just segue to the crisis in New York City that we're living through, people are dying every day. And a lot of people, even though things are now, you know, plateauing and whatever, there's still people dying. But the truth is, almost everybody's getting better. And we forget that quickly, right? That a vast majority of people are getting through this, getting out of the hospital if they go in, not going to the hospital because they don't need to. And I think the same has to go for parents thinking about children. That's scary news. And if people want to be really scared, I just spoke to an ER doctor this morning. There's a report out of Quebec about a daycare center that COVID went through, teachers and children. So just regular COVID. So we do have evidence that children are getting sick, but very few at the moment. And people need to really keep that in mind. I mean, you're talking tiny numbers at the moment. If my child had a rash, would I call the doctor? Yeah. But to really try to, it's really up to parents to try to manage the stress of this, because however stressed the parent is and anxious, it filters right down to their children. That's the children's world. They're absorbing it. So it's really almost like a mental game. How do I take this information and keep it in context so I'm not constantly panicking? Because that panic's not good for the adult, and it's certainly not good for the child who needs parents to be steady.
I have a question. Peter, you may relate to this. We both have seniors in high school, and it's a very, very difficult time for them. So do we let them grieve for what they've lost, or do we make them recognize the silver linings, that they're healthy and we're safe and blah, blah, blah? What do you recommend?
It's a great question. You know, they need to do both. First, you have to grieve. You know, you can't move to, oh, but I'm so lucky and there's so many things in my life and, you know, all the silver linings, until you can really put it out there that you've lost something, that there's sadness. There's no question everybody's lost something, but seniors, high school seniors, which you have, I have a college senior, you know, there's grieving there. I see it in all my Barnard and Columbia College students. You have to first recognize, I've lost something, this doesn't feel good, and they were gypped. There's no question they were gypped. On the other hand, there might be some positives that come out of it. You know, maybe when there is some ceremony, our son's ceremony was just delayed a year, you know, maybe there's going to be people at that couldn't have been, who knows? But you can't move to the silver lining first, and you have to balance the two. And it takes everybody a different amount of time to sit with the sadness and what becomes anger before they can say, hey, look, I'm okay, and I'm still going to get college in some form, but nobody even knows what that form's going to be. So you have to sit with it first, and then as well recognize that there are good things coming of this, even if we don't want to admit that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And we actually talked a bit about this last week on the show, grandparents and not being able to see their grandchildren. You know, that how do you advise grandparents and grandchildren in this difficult time?
Yeah. You know, this question came up like from the get-go. I think we were all aware that this beautiful intergenerational relationship was going to have to be put on hold because, of course, we know that COVID affects older people in a much higher degree. I think this is where technology comes into play, that there are ways to stay connected and you have to use them. There also, you know, for people who are local, there's ways to drive by grandparents' houses and, you know, be outside the, you know, the windows if you can't be in contact. You know, we've all read these beautiful stories of people celebrating with grandparents, either at a distance or through the windows. But the more you can stay connected, I think the better. And, you know, I've heard of children having, you know, bedtime stories a couple nights a week with a grandparent over, you know, the computer. So there's lots of ways to be connected, but then again, recognizing it's not the same. It's really, you know, having a meal with grandma and grandpa by computer is not the same as being there, and reminding children that this is what we're doing for now, but it's not going to be forever. We hope it's not going to be forever, but we're going to do this for now, and hopefully we'll get to see grandma and grandpa soon, is probably the key. But it's sad. It's sad on both ends.
How are you limiting your children's, you know, Fortnite numbers and being on their phones and screen time in quarantine?
You think I have a magic answer more than, it's, you know, it's very hard. And
what does the data say, Tovah? What is the data when, you know, you've crossed that? You know, we get a weekly alert every Sunday morning at early in the morning that my screen time is up 14%.
Yeah.
Magic number for children.
It's, look, I mean, we all on this call and anybody listening knows this is unprecedented. So, you know, I mean, I've been telling parents, at first I said, give everybody a free pass, like just survive. But now that this is going on longer, and depending on the age of the child, I mean, certainly for, you know, your elementary and even middle school children, they get stretched by this stuff. And I think the teenagers do too. It becomes too much, right? It's not relating as they want it to be. So you can talk to, you know, those teenagers about, what feels reasonable. I think it's really important that children come to meals with family, and, you can set limits on it. Like, we're going to have breakfast, lunch, dinner, you pick the meals together. We're going to go on a family walk and everyone's going to do it, even if you're pouting. But that puts in some sort of stops for them, or saying to them, are there other things you want to do? Do you like gardening in our beautiful garden? So to come up with other pieces, because I think it is so addictive, attractive at this point, and it's social. And we have to remember that, those of us who didn't grow up with it, it is social for the older kids, for the teenagers, very much so.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tovah.
Thanks
really
for
appreciate you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
feel free to stick around, and for the next 14 minutes or so, Niki, welcome. And
Thank you.
so nice to have you as well, Niki Leondakis. So Niki, you run one of the largest, CorePower Yoga is one of the biggest in the country, and I'm sure it's been a very, very difficult time. So how is the gym industry, the fitness industry, coping in this impossible situation?
It's pretty impossible.
Yeah.
It's really such a challenging time. The issues of human health and running a business that is designed to keep people healthy and well at a time like this is just so challenging. And the government is all over the board. So, the White House directives came out announcing that gyms and fitness would be in phase 1 of their, the White House's Reopening America plan. And with every state and every, jurisdiction coming out with their own individual mandates of how they will reopen, it runs the gamut from phase 1, as in Georgia, which kind of blindsided all of us, the governor of Georgia announcing with 3 days notice that everything's reopening and no guidance comes out about what that means. And finally, executive guidance comes out and it's unclear. So we have not yet opened in Georgia. We watched consumer sentiment. The people did not feel it was time. There were some gyms that announced opening, and there was a ton of backlash on social media because people didn't feel it was the right time, and they weren't ready for that, and we weren't ready for that as a country or as businesses. So we have not yet opened in Georgia. Some of the people in our industry have, slowly but surely they are, and we will in a couple of weeks, but we're doing it really thoughtfully and really carefully. Same thing with Texas, Nashville, South Carolina, they've all opened. We've been, this is one time where I told our organization that, I like to be first to market, but this is one time I don't want to be
Right.
at all. Let's be in the middle of the pack and see, how people respond, what the best practices are, and what it's like. But I have to say, the impact on the industry, and particularly the boutique fitness industry, is significant. The social distancing requirements, which we certainly respect and appreciate the need for, don't dispute that, really have reduced our capacities as a boutique fitness industry by about 75%.
Right.
Average. So, we could average 40 people in a yoga class, and now we're averaging about 10 mats, in a class with the following 6-foot distancing rules. So that's the right thing to do, for sure, from a health and human protection standpoint. What impact that has on the business is really challenging.
Niki,
I can imagine.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dan.
No, go ahead, Peter.
Have you been able to create any digital yoga classes that you've been able to provide for clients from their homes?
Yes, we did a quick pivot, and gosh, as soon as starting at the end of March, right after we kind of started sheltering in place, we began building our capabilities to do live streaming. And we didn't have those capabilities before. We had not done that before. We did have a digital asset called CorePower On Demand that is over 300 different types of yoga and meditation. classes on demand that people could subscribe to. It had been developed about over the last 2 years and hadn't fully been launched strategically. As my intent was that we would bundle it as part of a membership price point option bundled within studio membership. So it was kind of sitting there waiting for a strategy. So we were fortunate to have that in our archives that we were able to put out quickly, digital content. But live streaming became very clear as an opportunity to fulfill a need that taped video classes cannot, and that is the need for community and human connection in real time, with everybody locked behind, a Zoom screen all day, every day, and us knowing from our survey data what our members value most about their CorePower membership. It's, yes, the physical and mindful practice and what that brings to them from a health and wellness and grounding standpoint, but the sense of community and belonging and connectedness to their fellow students and the teachers in the studio they visit, multiple times a week is a huge part of our value proposition. So live streaming was something we're able to deliver that. So we had to build the capabilities to take reservations, to charge by class, and we've done that, and we just launched it on Tuesday. In the meantime, we were and continue to offering CorePower on demand content for free to all people everywhere, and live streaming content on YouTube for free as a service, because people need stress relief, they need physical movement, they need support at a time like this. And we felt it was very much aligned with our higher purpose and our mission, bringing yoga to people and the transformative powers of yoga to people everywhere. So it made our team feel great. And I think it engaged our membership and student base further to know we were doing something good for them at a time of need. And now we're pivoting, and we'll continue that in moderation, but we're pivoting into paid live streaming.
Yeah, crisis is a terrible opportunity to waste sometimes. So forcing that live streaming is going to help you in the long run, but it's unbelievable how fast you got that up.
It is fast because we had to build the capability to take reservations, online.
Yeah, and payment, yeah.
Because our classes could go in, we always made room for another mat. So you didn't, other than in New York City, that was the only place we ever took reservations, but nationally, and in every other market, it was walk in and we made room for you. And so the pivot to build the reservations platform and launch live streaming, that was fast and furious. And yeah, necessity is the mother of invention. A lot of innovation happened in the last month.
Well, that's the silver lining. I have a question, and we got a question from the audience, so I'll bundle it in. As you guys think about recovery blueprint, and actually and you mentioned it briefly, the organization of the space, the air circulation in the space, the sanitation in the space, safety equipment. I guess one, is the gym industry helping lobby so that you can get the federal government, state governments to help you bear the cost of any of these things? Is that included in the stimulus? And then two, what are some of your plans to do that?
It's such a good question. It's so interesting. As Danny mentioned, my background, I came out of 30 plus years in hospitality, and I spent the first half of my hospitality career in restaurants. And I served on the board of the National Restaurant Association for 8 years. And funny, I was on a panel of fitness CEOs yesterday that a lot of the law firms are organizing these conversations, as you understand they do, and which have been really beneficial. And we all agreed that our industry is not doing a very good job as compared to the National Restaurant Association in terms of lobbying for support and for help and to have a voice. No, we have not. The NRA, National Restaurant Association, and the other NRA has done an excellent job, has always done an excellent job with their lobby, with their voice in government and legislation, and really making sure people understand the value of, the employment and what restaurants bring to this country. But the gym industry has been slow to do that. And we as an industry through these roundtable discussions over the last few weeks that law firms set up for us, have vowed that we will come together and we will become a force and start to follow the great model that the National Restaurant Association has set. But historically, it's not been there and it isn't now.
Here's Dan.
I want to pivot.
Handstand.
But, by the way, Nikki,
For that handstand.
I haven't done one since.
Well, Danny's a natural athlete, so I just had to do a little bit of this and that, and he was up in a minute.
Well, it's a good plug for CorePower Yoga. If you go to CorePower Yoga, you too will end up doing handstands, headstands. Hey, let's talk about the RealReal, because it's actually a different industry. We have about 5 more minutes left, but obviously that's a leading online business, and I suspect it's doing quite differently than restaurants and gyms.
Yeah, I mean, it's had its fair share of challenges as well. But yes, I mean, it really is. It's an all online business, a little bit of bricks and mortar that came over the last couple of years. It's been in business about 8 years now and been doing quite well. So the bricks and mortar business is obviously shut down, but they weren't the bulk of the business. It's online, for those of you that don't know, luxury consignment, and the leader and by far in the space. The biggest challenge RealReal is having right now is the consignment process. You know, a salesperson comes to your home and helps you go through your closet, your jewelry, your things for resale, those luxury items that they know are hot and selling, and helps you unload what you're not using anymore and turn it into cash. Going into somebody's home is a challenge. Like others, RealReal has pivoted and has done implemented doorstep pickups, so people can just bag up their things. They come pick up. There's no human contact, and you know, ship back what isn't the right thing to sell or isn't going to sell. But you know, they've pivoted and innovated. But yeah, the biggest challenge is consigners. There's just they need a certain amount of inventory, and that
inventory.
Consigners, and their consigners are not as active as they were.
By the way, Peter, it's Nikki, it's a public company, right?
Yes, went public in June of this past year.
Yeah. And Peter and Johnny, anything before I keep firing questions? I probably have room for one more.
Well, it's interesting to me, Nikki. We know that outdoor activities, even group activities, are going to be much more palatable in the short term. So as the weather warms, any thought to holding all your yoga classes in municipal parks, or renting outdoor space, or changing your lease strategy to include a courtyard moving in the future?
Yes and yes. We are reopening our studios as appropriate. We're not rushing to do so, as I said, and even when the government allows for it, we're waiting and seeing, and the class capacities will limit in studio practice, augmenting with live streaming, but also we are securing parks, roof decks of buildings, and other outdoor spaces to put into our regular schedule so that people can continue their practice and can gather and get that sense of community and connection. And people do feel safer outside. And to some degree, as long as that 6-foot social distancing is practiced, it is a little bit safer outside because you're just touching less hard surfaces that can carry the virus.
You know, I think
it would allow you to build bigger classes as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's a strategy that I think is very tenable in the short term, because also the recirculation of air in your studios, the many more surfaces, walls and doorknobs and whatnot. So I think of, you know, doing yoga in a vineyard somewhere with social distancing is going to be much safer. And there's no doubt the transmissibility of the virus is much lower in outdoor space. So
right.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, so we are absolutely working on that. And we do a lot of that. Each time we open a new studio, we have events like that in outdoor spaces and in roof decks and such, courtyards, to promote the brand and to give people the experience. And we do sign up, for membership campaigns through those types of events. So we already have those venues identified and in the contacts in our, sort of organizational information database. So we're reactivating.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, Niki, thank you. And speaking of vineyards, how is Northern California treating you? Okay.
Awesome. I'm looking at vineyards right now. I'm grateful that I am sheltering in place in Sonoma County.
Nice.
Okay.
Niki,
Well, thank you.
Janie, before we
Thank
close,
you.
I know that obviously wellness is extremely important now. Niki, any words of advice, not only to the healthcare industry, but to everybody who's struggling? Give us how you find mental relaxation and calm, and how are you, if you were to give a 30-second elevator pitch on how we should handle our mental well-being, what would it be?
I would say taking care of yourself every day with whatever rituals and self-care practices are good for you, to schedule that into your calendar as an appointment and stick to it. So every day in the morning, I take a walk. I get up an hour before I need to and just go for a walk. Getting out in nature is really grounding for me and helpful, and that fresh air and just the greenery and the magnitude of the outdoors helps me maintain a level of perspective that helps me not feel overwhelmed by what I'm dealing with, as we all are. And, movement, yoga, breath, meditation. A lot of people struggle with meditation, but there are apps that are available. Even 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 2 minutes of meditation helps change, the makeup of your brain and your outlook and your emotional state. So state management, understanding that there's underlying anxiety in all of us right now, and managing that actively and with intention and scheduling that time is the most important thing you can do. There's a ton of content on YouTube, on Instagram Live, from the yoga industry, meditations, short practices. 10 minutes of yoga does a world of good. Remember to pause and breathe.
And Niki, a bottle of wine at the end of the day from one of the vineyards can help out too.
Immensely. A little bourbon here and there too, right, Danny?
Right, Niki. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to everybody who dialed in. I think that wraps us for the day. Everybody have a great weekend, and we'll talk next week. Take care.
Having me. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.